Hi there, Matrix, and welcome. My name is Clinton van der Merwe, and today we are looking at one of your human geography sections, which is ordinarily going to make up question 3 or 4 of the exam paper. If you have a look at your notes here, we're looking at the section called People and Their Needs, which always used to be traditionally the economic geography section of the Matrix syllabus. And if we go onto this next page, you'll see some of the key concepts or focus we're going to concentrate on today are listed over there. We've got economic activities, so we're going to look at the traditional question of primary, secondary or tertiary activities and how they couch those concepts and what they want to ask you. We're going to focus a little bit on agriculture as an example of primary economic activity as one of the case studies for the questions that we'll look at later. And then we're going to look at the industry or industrial side of the economy as well. Factors affecting economic activities. Why are certain things where they are, like industries located, for example. And then we'll also look at the factors that are favoring or hindering the development of industry in various regions, as well as the 4 regions of industry in South Africa. Finally, we'll look at the concept of industrial centralization. What is industrial centralization? How does it work? Why do we do it? And what are the pros and cons of that process? Or what is the good or the bad? Okay, so if we jump straight onto this very first slide, there's a structure of our economy, a nice flow diagram, which shows you how we look at economic geography or what economic geography is all about. If you have a look at this flow diagram over here, you'll see that we can break all economic activities into 3 areas, the 3 that I'm pointing out over here now. First of all, we can classify the economy according to various things. So we're going to define the concepts, things like GDP or gross domestic product, and then, like I said earlier, we're going to look at the primary, secondary and tertiary as well as quaternary activities which make up the economy, and also look at concepts there related to the money and how our country makes money, etc. Factors influencing the economic activities, these are your main ones. And you'll notice, unfortunately, this is a section in geography, unlike the physical geography section, where there's quite a bit of learning to be done. So you need to do a fair amount of reading as well as staying on top of things in the media and in the news if you're going to tackle question 3 or 4 and appreciate some of the human geography or the economic geography that's entailed in this section. So these big concepts here, economic, physical, political and social reasons, we'll touch on as we discuss that today. And then you'll see that it branches off, the flow diagram branches off here into this block called perceptions of decision making on location of industries and other economic activity. What influences where things are and why they are? A lot of it has got to do with history, the historic manufacturing reasons. We're going to talk about those. And here they are. We've got the Pretoria Witwatersrand complex, the Durban, Pinetown, Pietermaritzburg region, the Southwestern Cape area, and then also the Port Elizabeth or the Uitenhage section. Quite a popular question for the exams is the focus on spatial development initiatives, industrial development zones, or the GEAR program, which we'll talk about at a later stage as well. So all the economic sort of changes since South Africa's democratic transition in 1994 gets looked at in this sort of section here as well. All right, if we have a look at the first part, agriculture as an economic activity. We're going back now to the primary activities. Remember, they are fishing, farming, hunting, mining, quarrying, and there's one else that I've forgotten there. I think it's forestry. We'll talk about those in a bit more detail. But if we look at farming as a particular case study of primary activities in the economy, there's 2 ways that farming happens. Either intensively, which means there's many workers, very productive, high yields per hectare. There's a lot of money going into the development, and the farmer uses a lot of machinery. This word mechanization here means machinery. So, for example, a vegetable farm in the south of Johannesburg or a pig farm near Escort in KwaZulu-Natal, that would be an intensive farming practice where they are very intensively using the land. But then we also get extensive type of farming, where we're doing things on a large scale. There's the word large. So few workers, usually it's on land that is less fertile than usual. An example of this would be your sheep farming in the Karoo or the Northern Cape, where it's a wide, expansive area that we're farming on. And then there's a third category that some of the textbooks talk about and that you might have a question on in the exam called mixed farming, where we look at things like crop and animal farming at the same time. So they keep, for example, wheat, a wheat farmer in Caledon who's also breeding in ostriches, for example, etc., etc. Here are two photographs that I want you to look at. And based on what I've just said now, I would ask a question as follows. Is this an example of intensive or extensive farming? Now you can see from the photograph that we've got a tractor and another machine over there that's tilling the soil or plowing the ground, as it were. You get a sense from the photograph that this is quite a big piece of land, that's quite a big farm. So this would be an example of extensive farming. And what they would use these sorts of photographs in a question for, right? Here you can see this is intensive farming. There's manual labor involved. This guy is tilling the land or plowing the land using oxen and a plow that he physically stands on while they pull it along. These two examples here could be used to ask you if it is commercial or a subsistence type of farming. Now this would be an example of commercial farming. Remember, these are the two types of farming that we get in South Africa, and we're going to talk about these in a few minutes. Commercial farming, we're doing things for profit, large scale, to sell the food. It's a business. So this is your sort of traditional farming, crops and all sorts of things that is providing food for a nation, as it were. Whereas if you look at this example over here, this is an example of subsistence farming. Now subsistence, not to be confused with the word subsidence in climatology, which means sinking air. Right? Don't confuse your terminology in the exam. You do need to learn your definitions and know what you're talking about in this section of geography because it's very jargon-based or word-based. Subsistence farming, this guy's farming for himself or his immediate family. He's got a small piece of land here, maybe an acre or as big as a hectare maybe, and whatever they produce on this land is going to be used to feed the family and to subsist. That's what the word subsistence means, to look after yourself or to just get by, as it were. So that is the two types of farming that we need to keep in the backs of our minds when we're studying this section. Now, if you look at your notes, I've summarized there for you how subsistence and commercial farming differs. In each case, we're looking at the aim, the type, the method, and the ownership of the land. We're comparing all these variables, the challenges that these farmers face, and we're looking at it from two perspectives here. On the one hand, a subsistence farming approach, like the guy with his oxen, and on the other hand, commercial farming, where we had those tractors or those harvesters working the land. If you look at the aim, remember we said subsistence is only for his immediate family or his dependents, people that he has to feed or look after. Whereas commercial farming, we are market-driven and we're farming for a profit to make money. This is a business and we want to create surpluses. In other words, extra or a lot of must be produced. The type of farming, this subsistence farming would be normally your farmer who grows maize or vegetables or keeps a couple of cattle and chicken or sheep on his farm. Whereas in a commercial context, it can be intensive or extensive in its origin, whether you're farming on a small scale or a large scale. And there I've given you some examples of sugarcane farming in KwaZulu-Natal or maize farming in the Free State. It can be done on an intensive or an extensive basis, but it is commercially orientated, so it's being done for money or the making of money as well. Then in your methodology here, the subsistence farmers are using a lot of manual or traditional type of implements, a normal plow with cattle, whereas the commercial farmers are more scientifically orientated. They use machines, they use the latest technology, and they are very much big on land ownership or having extensive pieces of land that they're using to farm on. And there in the next block you see there, we talk about the fact that subsistence farmers may not necessarily own their land. They could be owning it as a community. There's communal grazing, there's communal farming. They each get their little piece of land that they have to till or to to work on and harvest their crops. Whereas in a commercial context, we're looking at a larger farm, single landowner, and fewer houses are on that piece of property or land, and they're farming on a large scale for their benefit financially to make money out of it. It's a business. Now, if we look at some of the challenges, you can see here that a subsistence farmer struggles to survive when there's things like drought or a heat wave or something like that. Many dependents to feed often cannot make his or her own choices, and the young people leave to go to urban areas, which means there's very little money available for them to develop their own land. Whereas a commercial farmer has more sort of worrying challenges in order of wanting to make more money, or he's got to borrow money, so there's financial difficulties that he has to deal with. And when disaster strikes, like a drought or a flood or something, he's got more to lose, as it were, than the guy who's just going to be without food for a season or whatever. Obviously, that's a very terrible thing as well, because his livelihood is going to be at stake. But you can see from this list here that in terms of scale, there's sort of larger losses in store for the commercial farmer as opposed to the subsistence farmer, who could maybe fall back on his family and get people to support him in his community if his farm sort of plummets or goes to ruin. On this next slide over here, you can see we've summarized for you the factors that affect agriculture or limit agriculture, and you'll see them listed there: physical, climatic, socioeconomic. Now, these three factors are just three of the main ones, but obviously there's many more reasons, political reasons, historical reasons, that you could learn about or read about in your textbook. And the trick is to do as much studying and as much extra reading as you can for this section of the exam, because it is less scientific than the physical side of geography. The human geography means you can rely more on logic or common knowledge or sort of general knowledge that you might have as well. So if you look at the columns here, we're looking at what promotes the agriculture or makes it more successful in regards of those three factors, or what limits or challenges it on the other side of things. And you can see there we've listed a couple of things, which I'm just going to pick up on one or two of them. First of all, physically speaking, flatter land or land that is low-lying in hills and open and extensive is better for farming, because obviously farmers need expansive regions or areas to farm on. Rivers, lakes, dams, any water source that they need to irrigate or to wet the crops that they are growing is obviously essential as well. And then you'll see their fertility, or having a deep fertile soil, is a good thing in most farming regions of South Africa. Limiting factors, physically speaking, if it is very steep or the gradient is undulating. Now, that word undulating there means hilly instead of flat or open. So if it's very hilly and you haven't got very large open areas where it's flat or gentle, then that's going to be a problem for agriculture. Your soil, if it's very shallow, or the fact that in South Africa we've only got 13% that is arable, in other words, good land that can actually be used for crop farming or for agriculture successfully, that's quite a small proportion of the land mass. And then if you lack water, such as perennial rivers, or you're not near a dam or one of your water schemes like the Lesotho Highlands Water Project, for example, or the Tugela Vaal scheme that we'll talk about at a later stage as well, that's going to be problematic as well. Climatology, or the local climate, is very important. South Africa has about 7 climate regions where we talk about tropical or Mediterranean, or your high veld, your low veld. Those areas and the type of climate that we have is going to be very significant for your farming. The lack of, or the good prospects of farming that you might have. Remember, in South Africa, the further west we go, the hotter it gets and the less water they receive in terms of rainfall, whereas the western side of South Africa is a little bit more well watered. So if you look at a map of South Africa, for example, if we just do a little quick picture in here, that line there that I'm talking about would be our 400 millimeter ISO height. Now remember, an ISO height is a line that joins places of the same rainfall. To the west of that line, we get less than 400 millimeters a year, and to the right of that line, we get more than 400 millimeters of rain a year. This has got to do with things like, when you go back to your physical geography, the fact that there's a warm ocean current here, more evaporation, so it rains more on the eastern side of South Africa, whereas here, coming from the South Pole, you've got the cold Benguela current, which means they get less evaporation and less rainfall. So it's obviously drier on the western side of South Africa, Very little agricultural produce comes from the Northern Cape, which is a hot, dry, sort of semi-desert, arid region of South Africa as well. If we look at some of those factors on the other side of the scheme, where factors that are obviously limiting agriculture, remember if we go up to that heading again, what's making agriculture less likely or less profitable or less good? The low average annual rainfall of South Africa, what I've just spoken about here, the fact that there's vulnerability or issues of drought and climate change that we have to contend with, and water is a big resource that we have to think about in agriculture, as well as things like pests and the quality of your soil and all those sorts of factors that you can speak of as well. Socioeconomic, or we can put the word political in here as well. Political forces or socioeconomic factors. We've got 7 commercial ports which allow for the diversity of agricultural farming, and education or resources, time, management, effort that's put into agriculture in our country is improving farming yields in South Africa. This is something we have to talk about when we look at things like food security. Are we going to have enough food? Are people going to have access to food, being able to buy food readily, etc.? That's going to be a big issue in South Africa with climate change and global warming and all those sorts of problems as well. Poverty. The rural poor have small plots or no access to land, lack of human resources, HIV and AIDS and how that takes out your labor force, animal diseases that threaten livestock. So we lose a lot of livestock, cattle, sheep, chicken, ostrich, like that big outbreak of bird flu, which meant that a lot of the farmers in Oudtshoorn or the Northern Cape had to cull or kill a lot of their stock. And that means they lose money, they lose their livelihoods as well. Lack of capital, lack of training, lack of fertilizers, all of these resources here are things that you need to think about as well or talk about in some of your answers when they're engaging you on some of these questions that you need to do in the economic geography section. All right. This slide basically just summarizes a lot of what I've been saying, so we're not going to work through it in too much detail. But basically, if you read through your notes there, we have summarized for you some of the big ideas or the main ideas of how agriculture contributes to South Africa's gross domestic product, the value or the level of goods that are produced in a year by a particular sector of the economy. And in the primary context, this primary activities, we're talking about things like hunting, farming, mining, quarrying, forestry, and all those basic things where we are taking a raw material and we are utilizing that for obviously a secondary activity that we're going to go into over now, where we process that or we manufacture that product, and obviously that leads to more wealth or the creation of more resources, which drives the economy even further. But this is an important part of the economy because most countries, depending on whether or not they are developed, developing, or underdeveloped nations, have to start off with basing their economy on the primary sector. So you'll find most of their population works or earns a livelihood from the primary sector of the economy. And as you grow as a developed nation, you find more emphasis being on your secondary, tertiary, and quaternary activities and far less being placed in the primary sector of the economy in terms of population, resources, time, energy, and money as well. All right, so here is an actual example of a question. Let's see how could they ask you some of the stuff I've been explaining in the exam, right? This is question 1 taken from a particular exam one of the years previously, and it tells you there in the preamble, refer to the figure which illustrates the dual economy of South Africa's farming activities. Now, just a quick tip here. When you are sitting in the exam and you're answering a question, you must spend a lot of your time and energy reading the information they give you, because this preamble that they gave you here gives you a lot of clues. For example, they speak of the dual economy. So now we know already they're talking about the fact that there's two things like commercial or subsistence farming, and this is exactly what this question is about, right? Farming activities, we're talking about primary economic activities. So obviously they're going to ask us something related to agriculture or farming, which is a primary activity. And the fact that they've said that dual economy with these two pictures gives you a clue that you are probably going to be dealing with the concept of commercial farming on the one hand versus subsistence Right, and if you look at these two photographs over here, based on what you've studied and the learning that you've done, here we can see there's a lady and a guy in the background who are tilling the soil, working with very rudimentary implements, a plow or a hoe and a pitchfork. And you can see some millies growing, cauliflowers, a pumpkin, and then maybe what are those tomato plants or potato plants in the background over there. Whereas on the right, picture B, we've got a harvester with a guy driving it and a whole extensive, huge piece of land where they've grown wheat or millies or something, right? You'll have to look very closely in the picture to see what it is. But let's have a look at the questions. They want you, if you look at the preamble just again, choose the correct letter from those given in brackets to make all of the statements true. Now, you must read your instructions in questions very carefully, because half the time people lose marks because they're not concentrating on what they have to do and they haven't read the instructions or they haven't followed instructions correctly, and you're throwing away valuable marks. So avoid that, make sure you know what is required, and then answer the question successfully or correctly. Right, so we've looked at these pictures, we've read the preamble, and we are now ready to roll in answering some of these questions. Diagram A or B illustrates commercial farming. Right, these are worth 2 marks each. This is a 5 times 2, a 10-mark question. Remember, in geography, we are giving you extra marks, or we're doubling the marks because there's thinking involved. Based on your learning, your prior knowledge, and your application of knowledge, we're rewarding you by doubling the mark. Right, so diagram A or B illustrates commercial farming. Right, so for this question, you're going to say it is diagram B. Remember, we want to make each statement a true statement. So the answer for 1.1 is B. Now, in your answer book or on your answer book, make sure that you write the number 1.1.1 and then just the letter B as your answer. Remember, people that are marking this don't have time to go back. If you've written the word commercial farming instead of just writing the letter B, they don't have time to go back and check, is B commercial or is it subsistence? And they're just going to mark it wrong, even though it might be right. So you must follow instructions. Remember, these poor markers are marking hundreds and hundreds of scripts, and they want to get through them. They don't have time to go and check your answers, especially if you haven't followed instructions. 1.1.2, again, we're making the statement positive or true. Diagram A or B will provide food security for South Africa. Now, there's that word food security I spoke about earlier. The ability of people to have access to, or there being enough food in the country to feed people in the first place. Which diagram out of A or B is going to make that possible? Not this one, because she's planting for herself, remember? She's only feeding her husband and her immediate family with her produce. B is the answer there again, because we want to produce en masse. There must be a surplus, there must be more than enough of it, etc., etc. Remember, you're getting 2 marks per question here, because this is a thinking and application type question. 1.1.3, farmers in diagram A or B will suffer worse consequences during times of drought. All right, now it depends from whose perspective you're going to answer this, because I'd say A, if all of her crops dies, if her entire produce is gone after the drought, she's going to be hungry and starve. Right, so you could say A is the answer. But then some people might say, well, this poor farmer is going to go bankrupt if he loses his entire crop. He has to sell his tractor or his harvester. The bank comes to repossess stuff out of the house if he can't pay back the loans because he hasn't made money from selling his produce that year, etc., etc. So this is a bit of an open-ended question, and depending on how your thinking motivates how you answer this, I think there is room for leniency, and hopefully the mark is allowed for that discrepancy. 1.1.4, the implementation of Agenda 21 will be of greater value to farmers in diagram A or diagram B. Now, if you haven't done your reading or your studying, you won't know what Agenda 21 is, and you're going to lose 2 marks here. So hopefully you've studied and you've done the reading I suggested. Agenda 21 is the policy or the program that the United Nations put forward at the World Summit on Sustainable Development, remember, where they wanted people on a local scale to implement sustainable farming practices, sustainable resource use. And if you read the document very carefully, it talks about how do we use our resources sustainably or carefully. So the answer for this is going to be diagram A, the subsistence farmer. This lady is going to benefit the most from Agenda 21, the sort of support from the government, tax incentives, all those sorts of little minor policies that the government's put in place at a local scale or a municipal sort of level, she gets benefits from growing her own food, reducing her carbon footprint, going through the motions of environmental sustainable management. The last question here for another 2 marks. This is a 5 times 2. 1.1.5, farmers in diagram A or B will make a greater contribution to South Africa's gross domestic product. Who's going to make more money and provide more impetus and influence in the economy? Okay, it's going to be diagram B, a commercial farmer, because all the food they sell and the profits they make and all that goes into the economy and gets pumped back into the sort of financial machine of South Africa's working. Right, so there's a typical question. This could be a question 3 or a question 4 scenario. Remember, as they start the question, it's always going to be easier one-word answers, true or false, choose the correct letter, or basically match the columns type of scenario. Very easy, comfortable question just to get you relaxed and into the motion of answering the paper. As you progress through the question, it's going to become more complicated with 2-word answers, sentence answers, even paragraph, or what they call an essay question, where they want you to talk about something for 6 marks times 2, which is 12. If we have a look at just some of these summaries over here to sum up now, economic activities are all the activities that contribute to the gross domestic product of a country. So that includes your primary, secondary, and tertiary, as well as quaternary activities. And remember, learning what those are is pretty much just your studying and your reading of this section of geography. The gross domestic product, or the GDP, measures the value of goods and services produced in a country in a year. That's your definition there of what GDP means. How much money, or the value of all the goods and services and produce that we make in a year, added together as a whole nation, that gives us a GDP. Your GDP per capita is the GDP divided by the country's population. So that's what sort of influence or input per person, that's what the word per capita there means, do we contribute or participate in the economy. Number 3, South Africa has a mixed economy because we rely on a mixture of primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary activities. And here's a summary of those things you would have studied, or hopefully you would have learnt about. Primary activities, we're dealing with anything that extracts raw materials, that uses the physical earth, and that would be your mining, farming, fishing, forestry. There could be others here as well. Hunting and quarrying is also considered to be a primary activity. Secondary activities, yeah, we start talking about things that are manufactured or processed into finished goods or materials. So your factories and your industries are secondary activities. The building industry, the construction industry, the creation of electricity or the provision of water is also considered a secondary activity. Anything that involves the utilizing of a raw material, processed or manufactured or changed further for our benefit of making something new out of it or using it for all sorts of things like water and power is useful for, that makes it secondary. Then you get tertiary activities, that's your service orientated, things that you get from your local government, banks, teachers, lawyers, doctors, professional and personal services, in other words, yeah, that makes for tertiary activities. But then also shops or retail, wholesale, transport, communication, and local government even, healthcare, hospitals, police station, all of those things are tertiary services because there's a service being provided and the economy is being driven or things are being allowed to have wealth or meaning through a process. Then a very new one that a lot of developing nations are quite big on, about 60% of their economies are based in the quaternary sector of the economy. That's your intellectual activity, things like data, research, telesales, culture, education, libraries, research, information technology. Some of these belong up here, but you can extend that definition a little bit more, right? Let's move on now to the structure of the economy and look at in industry. So in other words, if we focus a little bit more on the secondary activities of the economy, there are 2 basic types of industry. Either your heavy industry, you can see from the notes here, requires a lot of energy, raw materials, it pollutes a lot, it's bulky, it has machinery, it's noisy, and it happens on a large scale. Or you get light industry. Light industry is a smaller industry, smaller scale, requires a larger market and access to customers, but you're producing lightweight raw, you're using lightweight raw materials to produce a small product, like a small end product, for example. It uses light machinery that's not too noisy, not too sort of pollution bound, etc., and it employs a lot of people. So for example, if we give examples here, ISCOR or ESCOM would be an example of a heavy industry, and a light industry, we're talking about something like your textiles, people that make clothes, shoes, handbags, those sorts of things. All right. As a result of globalization, companies have been able to spread and operate around the world, and this has opened up new markets for them and given them access to new sources of raw materials. So the world becoming a smaller place, or the influence of globalization, changes the nature of your economy, whether it's primary or secondary based. And then obviously most economies have a tertiary sector or a quaternary sector, but depending on whether or not you are more developed or least developed, that'll be bigger or smaller, and the economy will proportionally be more of the one and less of the other. All right, let's move on to look at more industry-based things. Industry as an economic activity, factors affecting the location of industries. Now remember, where your industry is located has got to be or is influenced by a number of things. Physical factors, number one. Economic factors or reasons, number two. Social or other sort of cultural reasons, as it were, number three. And then your political factors, your history of the government, your history of South Africa, apartheid, townships, homelands, all of that comes into this section over here, which you will learn about or read about in your textbooks. If we look at physical factors, we're talking about things like where is the raw material that we're going to be extracting, the gold or the diamonds, the coal, right? Because where that is where the heavy industry is going to be located. So that's why we have places like Sasolburg and other cities like Johannesburg and Kimberley. They became places because of the physical factors that had the minerals or the resources there in the first place. And that's why your industries were located there. Also, you've got to be close to water. You've got to be close to transport. Things like railway lines and road networks are very important. Harbors, ports, and even these days airports, or being able to fly your product overseas. Economic factors, we're talking about things like where we're located in terms of our market, the customers, the people that are going to consume and buy our products. We want to be able to be close enough to that, to make it cheap enough to produce our product, and to cut down on all sorts of things like costs, transport costs, water costs, etc. Right, so certain activities need a large amount of capital as well. That's money, right? Investment, it's going to cost a lot of money to start this factory off or to get going. Socially speaking, there's all sorts of things. We need labor. People have to work in the factory. Your laborers, your miners, your people that are operating the machinery, etc. So we need a large quantity of that, and we also need a skill base. People have to be able to know how to mine or know how to operate a machine like a sewing machine, for example, etc. Right, you can see there's some examples there about personnel and how we use human resources as well. Political factors. This is a very broad topic, and the history of South Africa, as you know, with the apartheid policy, goes back to the homeland issue and where labor was located or housed. People weren't allowed in cities based on their skin color. So you'll find a lot of your industries are based in places where there were traditionally homelands or townships nearby, and that would allow the labor to come to work and to go home every day, but not infringe on the white spaces or the city or the urban areas, as it were. Okay, now the four regions that they always test. I've got a map of South Africa here, which I'm going to be drawing on and showing you what we're talking about. And remember, some of these have changed their names with political changes and sort of renaming of places in the modern day. So we need to take note of those as well. I'm going to do it in order of prominence or sort of proportionally the most successful regions. We start off with the first one here in Gauteng, which traditionally used to be called the PWV, the Pretoria Witwatersrand Vaal complex. But these days it's called Gauteng because Gauteng is the new province name of what used to be like the Transvaal and a small section of the Orange Free State and all those old 4 provinces. Now we have 9, remember. In Gauteng, we're looking at your sort of automotive industry as well, gold, mining, all of those that makes that a very big powerhouse or hub of economic activity. Then we go down to the second most successful one, which is Durban. All right, it's also called, in the old scheme of things, the Durban Pinetown region. But now with new name changes, right, they call this the eThekwini. Right, my handwriting and this pen needs to improve a little, but we're getting there. The eThekwini or Durban Pinetown region is number 2 down there in KwaZulu-Natal. The harbour and everything that goes with getting goods and services out there with the seafaring trade makes that a big hub over there. Then the third one is what used to be called Port Elizabeth and Uitenhage. Now it's got a new name because we know that the Nelson Mandela Metropole is the new name of that big region or that area, Metropolitan Council or Metro. That region there is famous for cars. Again, we know things like VW are down there. They've got their processing and their plants that make cars down there. And then the last one is number 4, Southwestern Cape. We just add in that word Southwestern Cape there. Southwestern Cape hasn't changed its name. It's always been known as the Southwestern Cape regions. These are the old names, some of them, and then the new ones I've put on here, eThekwini and Nelson Mandela Metro. And obviously we don't call it the PWV necessarily these days. It's now called the Gauteng regional extent. Right, let's take a quick ad break, and when we come back from the break, we'll look at these regions in more detail again. Welcome back. Before the break, we were looking at the factors that affect the different economic regions of South Africa, and we're going to pick up from that point again. If you have a look at your notes here, there are various things that favor or hinder why we have various economic hubs in South Africa. And remember, some of these, like I said before the break, have got new names or different names. So depending on what textbook you're studying from, you just need to be able to use both of those in the exam context as well. The Pretoria Witwatersrand Vaal complex, or what's commonly known as the Gauteng region now, basically has the metal, iron, steel, machinery, chemical, transport and equipment industries. And you'll see that the reasons for the development of that is because of things like gold in 1884, the fact that it was good agricultural land, and if you know a little bit about your history, the fact that everyone came up here to Joburg when someone sort of hobbled over a nugget of gold. There were various raw materials here, not just gold and diamonds, but also good water, transport, and the capital availability. By that time, we were still part of the British Empire, and they funded or paid for a lot of our mining processes. The limitations are that water is scarce up here. Housing and social necessities are not always adequate. We're very overcrowded in Joburg with a very big population. And we're far from the harbour. It's very expensive to transport all of these goods that we make and things that we do down there. The second region, eThekwini, or what's also known as the Durban Pinetown region, right? Remember, Pietermaritzburg area, sugar, chemicals, paint, textiles, shipping. The fact that it's next to a harbour or a port location, skilled labour, high, good rainfall, water supply, all of those things over there, suitable relief and market availability makes it a good place to have an economic hub or a centre. But the harbour development is reached its capacity, and remember there's talk of them having to extend or build a new harbour now. And the hilly topography or the relief of Durban is also a limit to space and the expansion of various factories and industries and things that want to get bigger as well. The third region, Southwestern Cape, main industries, wine, fresh fruit, packaging, dried fruit, canning, fish, clothing and food. There's all your reasons again there. And remember, historically this was the most developed city in South Africa, Cape Town, with the arrival of Van Riebeeck, the whole history of the colonial empire, and people stopping over at Cape Town as a halfway point to Europe in their little traverses or travels. But obviously there's also problems. We've got very little power sources there, although they do rely a lot on Coburg, but there's all the hoo-ha about nuclear power and the dangers associated with that. They've got water problems and all sorts of other things there. Few natural minerals means we can't really extend into other primary activities over there. Tourism is the big thing now these days in the Western Cape, and thankfully for that, things are going well, still as that being a powerhouse economically. The Nelson Mandela Metropole, or the Port Elizabeth Uitenhage region, there the cars, assembly points, vehicle parts is the big sort of secondary activity there. All the good things again. The railway lines is a big plus there. Labour pool, again, people can work there. And they are developing this IDZZ, something we're going to talk about just now. They're one of the forerunners or the sort of pioneers in this field of developing that which advances or develops economic growth and development potential in that region of South Africa as well. Right, so if we move on now and we have a look at this idea, industrial centralization is a concept where we traditionally concentrated a lot of our industries in one specific area, and basically it was used because of job creation, the income that was earned from exporting products, encouraging foreign investment, stimulating agriculture and mining in the region or area, and the development of infrastructure like rail and road and all those sorts of things meant that that was the sort of economic policy or process of the day. But there's been more and more problems associated with this idea of putting all your industry in one centralized place or region. Overcrowding, insufficient jobs and housing, lack of amenities, strain on infrastructure and resources, and then also all the pollution that it causes. Think of people living in Sasolburg, for example, with all the smoke and the asthma and things that they have to deal with on a daily basis out there. Thirdly, the move now is to encourage decentralization, and that's why we look at these 4 core industrial areas. The politicians or the planners of the day thought that we have to decentralize industry across South Africa to very key or relevant or good places of placing them, and that's why we've got these things. And how they did that in the olden days was they offered tax rebates, they provided the land very cheaply, the buildings, the transportation, and also the skills training. And by giving people these incentives or these sort of positives, they hope that people would decentralize and move to these various places and set up their businesses, their factories, and all those sorts of things. So the modern day way of trying to decentralize or to do away with centralization, right? If we want to cross this centralization policy out and say that we want to decentralize all the industries and where places are, then we need to focus on a new approach. And this is where, if you look at your textbooks now, they talk about industrial development zones or IDZs, spatial development initiatives, SDIs, and the reconstruction and development program, the RDP, which you're familiar with, as well as the GEAR program, or the Growth, Employment and Redistribution Plan or Program, which stands for GEAR. Now, before I show you where they all are on this map, I just want to quickly hop forward one and then come back a slide. Here's the definition of what a spatial development initiative is. It's an integrated planning tool aimed at promoting the investment of a particular region in the country which is underdeveloped but has got potential for growth. The methodology involves a process in which public sector, the government, as well as your public-private partnerships or business, big business, people that have money, work together and they build a sort of spatial development initiative. Now, here's an example of Cape Town's spatial development initiative. And if you have a look at this map, you can see all the different color codes is the various parts of their economic development and what they want to achieve with their SDI. Now, there are various SDIs in South Africa, and I'm just going to quickly point them out to you over here on this map of South Africa. Right, there's 10 of them in total. The first one is called Saldanha, and you'll see that one is down here in Saldanha Bay. There's the first spatial development initiative, which is part of the Western Cape. Then you get the Fish River, which is down here. The Fish River, or the second SDI, is just there between East London and Port Elizabeth, around that region of the Eastern Cape over there. The third one is called the Wild Coast, and that develops this sort of part of South Africa over here, right? Because what used to be down there, the Transkei and those sorts of places associated with apartheid and the homeland policy, that's being rejuvenated and redeveloped, and a lot of energy is being put into the economic growth of that region in that Spatial Development Initiative, the Wild Coast SDI. Then the KwaZulu-Natal SDI around Durban, Richards Bay, that sort of area over there is the fourth one, which is just called the Durban or KZN SDI. Then number 5 is the Limbombo up here, right, where you've got the Limbombo Mountains there in Mpumalanga between us and our neighbor there, Swaziland. That Spatial Development Initiative is basically a combination of Mpumalanga and KZN cooperation to work over there, and we spell that with an E, Limbombo Mountains, like that. And then the 6th one is the Maputo Corridor Development, right, which runs across here into Mozambique, Maputo, and all the way across into Rustenburg and those sorts of places of the Northwest Province. The Maputo Corridor is an SDI where we're working with a country like Mozambique with trade relations and getting our products across to that port, and obviously so that we can get our stuff to markets across there as well. Number 7 is the Palabora area, which is just here next to Nelspruit, Palabora, and we spell that P-H-A-L-A-B-O-R-W-A. Palabora SDI is located there on point number 6 over there. And then the 7th one, remember I said there was 10, is the Rustenburg. There it is. Rustenburg is quite a relatively new spatial development initiative, trying to develop that area as well. Number 8 is the Trans-Kalahari Transport Corridor, all the way here from Rustenburg across to Walvis Bay is number 8. And the Trans-Kalahari is obviously also another one where we are working with a country like Botswana across the Kalahari Desert, as it were, to basically deal with developing those regions and those towns along that route as well. And then the last one, number 9, that's number 9. And then we've got Palabora, I've spoken about over there, which is as a town in that region over there, an SDI as well. Now, an SDI, or a Spatial Development Initiative, is quite a new concept in economic planning and in spatial development terms. And what the government does is they give all the industries or the factories or the manufacturing industry that's part of this process tax incentives or financial breaks to make it worth their while to get involved or to be a part of this process. The second economic approach or plan that governments try to use is something called an IDZ. Now, IDZ stands for, if we go to this one over here, an Industrial Development Zone. IDZs are basically purpose-built industrial estates geared for duty-free production of goods that we export, and it plays a hugely important role in South Africa's macroeconomic policy, right? It provides transport, logistics, business services that are tailored for the export-orientated industry. Now, if you look here as an example of the Port Elizabeth IDZ, and East London has got their own IDZ particularly, there's a nice website that you can visit to find out more about that. And if you go to these web links here in your notes, you'll see a website, which I've already got over here. It's called the East London IDZ. There's a good YouTube clip that you can play here. It's a minute and a half or so if you want to find out what an IDZ in that region of South Africa is all about. And there's a lot of good information over here. And if you just go about and you look at all sorts of things here, for example, what is the IDZ at a glance, where are they, what's the proximity or the extent of it, the scale of it, etc., you can learn from that as well. All right, now the IDZs, there's also a number of those in South Africa, and I quickly want to point those out to you as well on this map, which I've cleaned. There are 6 or 7 of those that you need to know about as well. The first one, again, is in Saldanha Bay over here. Let's just get our pen back and alive. Right. The first one is Saldanha. Now, Saldanha IDZZ is down there in the Western Cape. Then you get Kucha, which is just over here next to Port Elizabeth. Now, Kucha is another ITZZ, quite a leading, pioneering one in South Africa as well. So go and Google it or look it up on the internet and read up a little bit about that. But most good textbooks have got good explanations or good summaries about these IDZs I'm talking about. Then the third one is the West Bank. It's called West Bank. And that one is here in East London. And then we've also got Durban is the fourth one. Richards Bay, just further up on the coast here, is the fifth one. Johannesburg is also a IDZZ. And then we've got Polokwane, which used to be called Pietersburg, remember, in the Northern Province as their provincial capital city. And the last one is Uppington. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of those that you need to learn or that you need to know about as well. All right, if we have a look at the last policy, economic policy, what is called GEAR, the Growth, Employment and Redistribution Plan. This was put together in 1996 by the new democratic government of South Africa. And what this plan wanted to look at is how we can privatize and also remove exchange controls in businesses or in small, medium, micro enterprises, what we call SMMEs, which were also born from that sort of influence. It's a long run vision, and I've taken an excerpt here. You can read this in your notes. This is basically the introduction paragraph to that policy or that program. And you can see here, it wants to do things like make us competitive and fast growing, redistribute income and wealth and opportunities so that the poor are favored, create a sound health, an educated and well-serviced sort of population and South Africa, and ensure that there's an environment where homes are secure, places of work are productive, and everyone is benefiting socially, economically. So social justice, environmental justice are big things over here. And they talk about the Reconstruction and Development Program as well, which underpins or influences this policy of economic growth or economic development. Okay, so there's the source, if you want to go and source it on the web to read it up in a little bit more detail. Here's an example of how we could ask you some of the things I've been talking about now in the last sort of 20 to 30 minutes. Question 2, define the following concepts. Now remember here they're wanting you to give a longer answer, a sentence or at least a little bit of a paragraph in some senses, but be guided by the mark allocation. If it's only for 2 marks, you can get away with just writing 1 or 2 sentences to answer that question. So what is a heavy industry? Remember we said it's one that happens on a larger scale, and it involves capital. It needs quite a big influence of capital. It's responsible for employing a lot of people. And it's also got negative things like it creates a lot of pollution. Right. Give an example there. So, for example, say we're talking about things like the iron and steel industry, or ISCOR as an example. And then you will get your 2 marks over there. Light industry, for 2 marks, we would say things like it's a smaller scale, something that employs less people. And this is an industry or something that obviously creates fewer or less pollution. It's not too noisy. It doesn't pump out gases into the atmosphere, etc., etc. So we're talking about something like your textile industry or a factory that makes boxes or cartons, etc., etc. Right, number 2, what is a ubiquitous industry? Now this question, remember terminology is very important and you need to know what words mean. Now this, the answer to this question over here is that we're talking about light industries which are characteristically emphasizing local produce or working on manufactured goods, low order functions, services, things like that, which is local and small scale in its origin. 2 marks. Question 2.3, name 2 key objectives for creating IDZs. Are these key objectives feasible for local people? Now, this is a double-barreled question. 2 times 2, 4 marks here. You've got to answer 2 questions in one. So break it down and look carefully at how you're going to answer this properly. All right, any 2 of the following would be acceptable. First of all, we must address the first issue. Name 2 key objectives of creating IDZs. What are IDZs supposed to do? What is their function? What is their purpose? They provide the government with assistance and support to the poor and historically disadvantaged where economic potential exists. So basically, the government basically uses this policy for poverty reduction. So you can talk about poverty reduction, or you can talk about, oopsie, let's get rid of that, right? Poverty reduction, employment equity, all of those sorts of things come into play over here. You can also talk about your second point, because remember you need 2 things over here to get the 2 times 2 marks. It promotes trade and industry with an aim of creating jobs. So you can talk about job creation and the fact that there will be less poverty as well, or less unemployment, etc., etc. If you say things like international competition promotes more competition, promotes investment in these areas, private sector investment, promotes participation between different economic sectors, all of these ideas will get you your 2 marks, and that will be 4. 2 times 2, 4 marks. Question 2.4, name the 2 problems associated, right? What are the negative things associated with industrial centralization? Remember, again, 2 ideas here for 4 marks. So there we're saying things like overcrowding. Remember, industrial centralization caused overcrowding of industries, too many people. That leads to a lack of housing, or the fact that people have to now go and live in informal settlements because there's not enough houses built, etc., etc. That leads to other problems, things like unemployment, children not going to school, all of those sorts of things. So you can say 2 ideas here for 2 marks. 2 times 2, 4. Last question. 2.5, provide 1 solution to the problems caused by industrial centralization. So what would you suggest the government do to solve this issue or to do away with this problem? And pretty much you can talk about the industrial decentralization policies we've spoken about, things like SDIs, IDZs, the GEAR economic program, for example, environmental management processes that are allowing for places to be more green, less pollution, industrial estates, putting factories and manufacturing houses into areas that are away from obviously residential areas, so you're dealing with things like noise pollution, air pollution, etc., and you're solving those sorts of problems. Any idea here worth 2 marks is going to get you those 2 marks over there. All right, here is a question which is based on a source. So look at the map below and answer the questions that follow. You've got a map of South Africa with all the 9 provinces, and then 4 sections have been highlighted, A, B, C, and D, and the questions want you to do the following. Identify the industrial areas marked A, B, C, and D on the map respectively. Remember, these are the 4 economic zones or hubs that we spoke about previously. So this is the Gauteng or the PWV, 1 mark. This is the eThekwini or the Durban Pinetown region, as it's called in the old terminology, 1 mark. This is your Nelson Mandela Metropole, down here by what used to be called the Port Elizabeth Uitenhage Economic Hub. And then the last one here has always been called the Southern or the Southwestern Cape Economic Region or Economic Hub. That's Cape Town and Saldanha and those sorts of places down here. Okay, so 4 times 1 here for those 4 labels that we gave here gives you your 4 marks over there. Then provide 2 factors that promote this industry. What do you need to have those industrial areas? You need things like raw materials, 2 marks. You need things like a good supply of power and water. Water is very important for factories and industries. You need unskilled labor, so you must talk about labor here, people that are going to work in these factories or these mines or these industrial plants. Good transport infrastructure. All of these are good ideas, but we only need 2. So I've given more than what's required here. You would have got 2 marks for that, 2 marks for saying there must be enough power supply, 2 marks for saying there must be enough water supply, 2 marks for talking about the cheap labor, the availability of labor, etc. And then another 2 marks about roads and railways and those sorts of things as well. Number 3, state the main type of industry found at B. Now let's just remind ourselves, what is B? What is Durban, Pinetown region or eThekwini economic hub famous for? They are famous for things like food processing and textiles, fishing, packaging, canning, producing of power stations, power electricity, petroleum. There's a big refinery down there, which you can talk about there in Richards Bay, and there's another one also in Durban. So all of those there, 1 idea for 2 marks. All right, question 3. Now they start asking us about zones. For each of the 4 main industrial zones that we've just spoken about there, in South Africa, give an example of 1 main industry. Now, this is quite a big question. 4 times 2, you need to give 4 ideas that you've explained or proven or shown, and then you're going to get your 8 marks over there. So if we talk about Gauteng first, we've got to list each 4 of them and then give an example. We can say iron and steel or metal, the metalwork industry over there, engineering, chemical, etc. 2 marks. Then for the Durban, Pinetown or eThekwini region as it's known, we talk about the fact that they are famous for sugar or refining, fruit, chemical industry, motor vehicle production. And in the memo there, they talk about something called rayon. Now rayon is a manufactured or a regenerated cellulose fiber, something they use in making fibers or cables. Thirdly, we've got the Southwestern Cape, SW Cape here. That's famous for things like wine, food processing, textiles, clothing, fishing, canning, packaging, etc., etc. And then we've also got the wine industry or for fruit, dried fruit particularly, and cereals is down there. Remember the fruit juice, etc., etc. The last one we talk about Port Elizabeth or Uitenhage. That economic hub or zone is famous for things like the motor vehicle industry. Remember, VW is down there, and also some other motor companies. They build cars, and we sort of export them from that point as well. Or you could have spoken about things like textile, wool, leather, fruit again, etc., etc. Spatial development initiatives and IDZs, or remember IDZ stands for Industrial Development Zone, are economic development programs. So it's a statement. Which economic activity do they promote? For 2 marks. Okay, remember we're talking about industry or the secondary activity of the economy. So you can talk about secondary economic activities like industries or factories, etc., and you'll get 2 marks over there. Briefly discuss the negative and positive impact that SDRs and IDZs have had on economic growth in South Africa. Right, here we're looking for things like they create jobs, so there's employment. That's a positive, 2 marks. Increased economic growth, 2 marks. They help with the upliftment of people in the area, right? Housing, services are improved, etc., 2 marks. Negative things would be things like it leads to more centralization, you could argue, 2 marks. The SDRs and IDZs concentrate growth in one area, so it creates more overcrowding, traffic, congestion, those sorts of things become an issue. And then other surrounding areas tend to get neglected or sort of marginalized, and that becomes a problem as well. Right, so there we have those sorts of questions. Now we're going to move on to a new section, which is the human-environment interactions. And you'll see there from your notes that we're talking about the environmental problems or the social sorts of problems, political and economic issues that we're dealing with in this section. Big concepts or big things that you need to be familiar with, like environmental injustice and social injustice, those sorts of things, poverty, environmental risks, hazards, social ills, crime, all of those are big issues here that we need to be familiar with if we want to master this section of the exam or this section of the syllabus. And we talk about things like the effects of apartheid and the sort of injustices of squatter camps and informal settlements, the lack of amenities and services in rural communities, and all those sorts of aspects. And if you look at this list here, people should have or have the right to the access of natural resources, having an equal say in decision making and power sharing, local governance, access to land, the protection against economic damage, or the environmental health and safety and well-being. All of these issues here, which are part of things like the RDP and the GEAR and the SDIs that we've just been speaking about, you have to know about as well. Here's a very nice YouTube clip which you can go and watch, which is put out by the World Bank, and it summarizes a lot of these issues that I'm talking about in this section in a nice little 4 or 5 minute clip that you can see and go through. Right, there's some more notes here about the companies, transnational corporations, multinational companies, or MNCs as they are abbreviated in some notes. And then a lot of definitions that you need to be familiar with, like footloose industries. What do we mean by greenfield sites? What is a brownfield site, for example? If you look at these definitions here, if you study your definitions properly, you'll be able to answer some of the questions that are posed to you in the exam scenario. Right, so let's see if we look at some of those questions. Here's an example of a economic geography section B question 4 scenario in the exam. And you'll see they'll always start with the first couple of questions as being straightforward knowledge recall types of things. Provide suitable explanations for the following terms. So basically, give a definition or explain what the following things mean. And if you look at your mark allocation, it's worth 2 marks a shot. So you need a sentence nicely written up, constructed, and coherently answered to get your 2 marks. So what is GDP, or what do we mean by gross domestic product? Remember, your textbook definition is the total value of all goods and services or services that a country produces in a year. Produced in a year. And remember, this is how we measure wealth. This is how we can see if a country is rich or not rich or poor, etc. Quaternary activities. Right, another 2 marks. We're talking about activities that involve research and the use of data or information. So I'm just putting keywords now here, but you need to, in the exam, write coherent, nicely structured sentences to get these 2 marks. A footloose industry, remember the definition I've just shown you previously in your notes, is an industry that can be located virtually anywhere. It's not bound by its resource or its material or its labor force. It can be basically anywhere, located in any vicinity or area. What is a brownfield site for 2 marks? Abandoned or underused industrial and land that is contaminated by waste, industrial waste. It can be reused if it's clean or rehabilitated. Trade surplus. What do we mean by trade surplus? Trade surplus is obviously when you've got the value of exports exceeding or being higher than imports. So there's 2 marks there. Question 4.2. In the post-apartheid years, the government had tried to address the inequality caused by apartheid. List 3 possible policies that have been introduced to attempt to address inequality in South Africa. Now, this is a 3 times 2, 6 mark question. So this is your paragraph type question where you're going to write 2 or 3 sentences where you've said 2 or 3 things with evidence or with examples, and you're going to get times 2, 6 marks. So to answer this question appropriately, we're talking about things like Black Economic Empowerment, or BEE, the Reconstruction and Development Program, the building of houses, even things like employment equity, or EE, where obviously companies had to employ the right proportion of people according to races, gender, etc. And then the GEAR, growth, employment, and redistribution, will be a big part of this answer, where you explain what GEAR is, how it works, and what it's meant to do, right? To facilitate economic growth in areas where there's potential, tax incentives, allowing for people to have black economic empowerment policies as part of their work programs, etc., etc. That gives you your 6 marks over there. Question 4.3, despite these policies, things like GEAR, SDIs, IDZs, etc., unemployment remains very high, and a high percentage of people employed in the informal sector remain as well. So for 2 marks, what is the informal sector? People that are casually employed, they work for themselves, people selling stuff on the side of the road, or running a spaza shop, for example, those sorts of things here. Another paragraph type question where you need 3 distinct sentences with good ideas, and then you're going to get your 6 marks. So people that don't have benefits like pension or a medical aid, those sorts of things you will build into this answer as well. They work for themselves, hand to mouth sort of living, as it were, and they obviously don't earn a high salary, they don't do too well economically, they are in survival or subsistence mode. 4.3.2, also a big question, 4 times 2, 8 marks, so at least 6 or 7 sentences in a paragraph. What are the problems associated with working in the informal sector? So here we're looking at things like crime, low wages, no medical aid, no pension, no sick leave, no annual leave, no labor or union representation or protection, and all those sorts of things that go along with that as well. They can't save for their old age, and obviously if they get sick, they obviously don't get the best medical attention, etc., etc. So you can basically flesh out quite a few ideas here for 8 marks, and that will be section B, question 4. Right, so it finishes up there with this question, 4.4. Why do some companies employ people as casuals or informal laborers or workers instead of full-time staff? Basically, they can pay them lower wages. They are easy to dismiss. You don't have to go through the whole process of giving them warnings and all sorts of things. They don't have the same labor protections and benefits, as it were, pension, medical aid, and all those sorts of things. And it's cheaper for the company to employ this. It basically comes down to cheap labor, right? They don't have to pay them all those other extra things that you get if you're full-time or if you have a contract. Now, question 5 is a long question here. We've got a story below, which is based on a town in Kano in Nigeria, and refer to the figure on the following page to answer the questions. Now, it's important for you to read this preamble, to look at the visuals, to interpret the diagrams, or in this case, it's a map and a photograph, and to come to terms with what you need to answer or what they want you to tell them. So it reads as follows. People in Kano are cutting down trees and shrubs to meet their demands for fuel wood. People need wood to cook, clean, to make fires, for cooking, boiling water for cleaning, etc., etc. About 40 kilometers around Kano has already been stripped of trees. Urban growth has increased pressure on the countryside and city. So we've got some big issues coming here, environmental management issues, deforestation, etc., etc. Farming patterns have been forced to change, where cash crops are grown on soils that are not suitable for them. Subsistence farmers are unable to pay, right? I'm highlighting some of the key points here that you must sort of highlight or flag as issues that might be questioned. Subsistence farmers are unable to pay their rent and are forced to leave their land. New landowners are reluctant to farm as there is a greater demand for money to be made by selling of the land for urban development. So here's a map of Nigeria, and there's the city of Kano that we're talking about. Here's a photograph of people collecting this firewood that they were speaking about in the preamble. And there's a little bit of a flow chart over here where they're talking about inputs. People's demand for fuel wood is an input. The process is collect or cut down the shrubs or deforest the area. Outputs is that we have the removal of trees, the loss of protection of the topsoil, and the trees as canopy also, loss of soil moisture, and loss of organic matter in the soil as well. So there's environmental degradation or soil erosion as a potential issue over here. Right, so let's just quickly have a last look at some of these questions. We've got question 5. What are the 2 main reasons for the removal of trees around Kano? Remember, you can get some of these answers by going back to the preamble and just looking for the answers over here. People are cutting down trees to meet their demands for fuel wood. There's one answer, 2 marks. And also urban growth or expansion. People are cutting down trees to make space for houses or to extend the suburb that you live in, etc., etc. 2 marks. Question 5.2, describe one impact of urban growth on farming. Now, it's important when you're looking at your exam as well to look at task words or keywords. Okay, what does it mean to describe something? They want a fair amount of detail. A description is quite sort of detailed. So you must answer, even though it's only for 2 marks, you must give a description of one impact on urban growth that urban growth has on farming, as it were. Right, it reduces the amount of land available for farming. Like I said earlier in your notes, they don't have enough soil area to grow the crop, etc. It also creates a demand for agricultural production. So that's problematic. Question 5.3, state 3 negatives. State means you must literally list 3 negative effects that the removal of trees will have on the environment. So we are literally just making a list of 3 things for 6 marks. The first one, topsoil will be more easily eroded. Why is the topsoil more easily eroded? Because if we've removed the tree which roots the soil together and binds the soil profile, remember, go back to your ecology and all the biophysical geography that you've learnt. Take out the trees and the topsoil is going to be more easily eroded through agents like wind or water, all of those things that erode the soil. Okay, 2 marks. Question 2, or second point rather, let's say, because we're looking at 3 negative effects here. There will be a loss of soil moisture. Remember, if the trees are being chopped down, not only are the roots being taken out and the soil is going to be compromised to erosion, but the fact that the canopy of the trees is now also gone because the tree's been removed means that there's more sunlight. So there's more evaporation and the soil moisture is going to go down, or the soil moisture is going to be decreased. And a third one would be, let's say, higher levels of carbon dioxide. Now, we all know the story about global warming or climate change. If there's less or fewer trees, obviously we're going to have more carbon dioxide because the trees are not recycling that and turning it into oxygen, which we need. And that's going to lead to obviously a higher sort of incidence of global warming or higher levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is a climate change issue. 5.4, suggest 2 ways in which the local community can be encouraged to stop destroying the trees. Okay, now, as you can see, as we progress through these questions, a lot of it now has started becoming more opinionated or open-ended. So if you can give a logical answer with a good explanation, you're going to get the maximum marks. All right, so the first suggestion that I'm going to make that the local community can be encouraged to do to stop destroying the trees would be things like community education projects or outreaches. So if we teach people about the value of trees and we show them why it's important to have trees and what value they have for our health and for the environment's health, that could be a good approach, 2 marks. Or you could provide them with alternative sources of fuel. Okay, provide them with alternative sources of fuel. Please remember to write neatly. If your examiner or your marker has got someone like me, they have to really try and decipher what I've written here. So the neater you write, the more marks you're going to get as well, because the marker is not working that hard to having to look at your scribble. All right, one of the main characteristics of South Africa, this is now question 6, is the extreme economic inequalities found in the society. These differences are as a result or are based upon provincial, racial, gender, and urban rural issues or bases. Suggest one practical solution for each of the 4 headings in order to help address economic inequalities. Briefly explain each point. Now, remember, in this question, we have to basically give quite a lot of detail because it's a 4 times 2, 8 mark question. There's 4 headings or 4 things they want you to talk about, respectively. A, provincial issues, B, racial, C, gender, etc. So when you're talking about each one in turn, make sure you write enough, a whole sentence or 2 sentences explaining or expounding or justifying or elaborating on what needs to be done. And remember, the key word here is solution. What practical solution can you give in those themes or those headings, which is going to allow us to address economic inequalities, why we have rich, why we have poor, why we have access, why we have lack of access, etc., etc. So in the first instance, we're talking about provinces here. A is province. How could provinces address economic inequality? Well, certain provinces are richer than others, or more well off than others. So maybe they can pay slightly higher taxes. Now, this is a contentious issue. If you've been watching the news and you all know about e-toll and Gauteng and all of that, why should we pay all these extra taxes just because we have a rich province? But this is a good, valid idea. It's a socialist sort of argument, and so you'll get marks for saying this. Okay, we get places like the Western Cape that are doing so well, etc., or Gauteng, etc., to pay more taxes because they're slightly richer or they're more well off. Okay, 2 marks. B, the next heading there is racial. What sort of racial healing processes, reconciliation, etc., could be done? So we could promote more employment equity. Again, another contentious issue. And if you've been watching the news lately and all those sorts of things that come up in the news about paintings, etc., this is the type of thing we have to do. Equity and racial reconciliation, get people to understand each other's cultures, walk in each other's shoes. All of those sort of esoteric arguments can be made here, and you can get 2 marks. Remember, we want logical, decent, coherent sort of statements, and if you have a good idea, you're going to get a good mark. Then the third heading here was C, gender. So the differences between why some companies employ more men than women, or women's rights are violated, etc., etc. So there we would want to promote more women to senior positions, right? And a lot of companies are doing this these days. All the very well-qualified, experienced ladies in the company, they get promoted sooner, and they get obviously allowed growth and development in the company's executive structures. The last one, urban or rural issues. How can we deal with urban or rural issues that are going to address economic inequalities? Remember, you are answering the question. Always come back to the question and make sure you're answering what you need to be saying. Improve service delivery. You know that urban areas have all the good services. Refuse, water, sanitation, all of those things are not problematic. In rural areas, we've got the bucket system, we've got all those problems with sanitation and toilet and running water. So improved service delivery in rural areas can be your argument there. And you must also obviously give examples. So you will mention things like sanitation, running water, sewerage, all of those things in your answer over here. As long as you've answered something coherently and in a nice, decent, sort of logical statement or sentence, you're going to get the mark. That's all we have time for this time. Join us again next time for some more economic geography. But remember, the thing about this section is reading and really studying. So as much extra reading and studying as you can do, and staying abreast of stuff in the news and the media will stand you in good stead. Good luck.
Yeah.